Good evening, I'm Greer McGeary, President of Seahorse Victoria. My guest today is Siusan MacKenzie, CEO of Emergency Services Foundation. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you for having me.
One of the intriguing things about foundations is it tends to cover a lot of area. So what is Emergency Services Foundation?
We're a very small organisation, Victorian based, and I like to say small but with huge ambition. And basically we exist to bring the Victorian emergency services together to collaborate in the area of mental health and wellbeing, which is a huge issue across the sector. But our particular focus is upstream, so we're not treating sick people, but what we're trying to do is prevent mental injury to people and intervene early, because we know that if you intervene early when you've got a mental health issue, the chances of recovery are much greater. So that's the space or the gap that we're filling in the sector.
When did the foundation was founded?
Well, it's a bit of an interesting journey actually, because it was actually founded after Ash Wednesday in Victoria in 1987, so years and years ago, but it was founded with a different purpose then. Unfortunately, in that event, 14 CFA volunteers died and their families basically got a pat on the back. And when the review of that happened, the guy who was doing it, Mick Miller, who was the chief of police at the time, he said, this isn't good enough. These people have given their lives. We need to do better for them. And went to the government and said, let's start an organisation, a foundation, so that we can provide some financial relief to their families. And so they did that for many years, and it wasn't a huge amount of money. It was a relatively small amount of money by work cover terms, and they did that for many years. And then about 6 years ago, they did a review and said, we need to think about, do we still need to do this? Because, the landscape has changed now. There's work cover, there's better operating procedures and so forth. So they changed, and I came in and did a review and said the thing that's coming over the hill that's going to sock everybody in the forehead is mental health and wellbeing.
Yes, because that's one of the areas I think it touches on so much of society, and we're seeing, footballers and the like giving it a lot of publicity. But I know in the trans community, for instance, it's been an issue for many years because of the stigma of sort of being different and leading to suicides and other harm like that. So being emergency services, each of the services obviously, can be very intense for moments, and you're sitting around sort of apparently idle for a period of time. So it's sort of
they would dispute that.
Yeah, well, no, but in a sense of,
yes, I know what
I
you
think
mean.
A lot of people, for a moment, and then there's this bigger adrenaline rush when you've got to perform your duty. Where do you actually touch upon each of the services?
We bring the services together to try and help them do the best they can in this space, because as employers, they've all got a responsibility under the Occupational Health and Safety Act for the physical and the mental wellbeing of their people. So that's their responsibility, and they do things, but we do things that they can't do. So we do research about leading edge programs. We identify gaps and we say, well, what's the best we can do in this space? And we do that research, and then we translate that into something that the agencies can use. So, for example, one of the things we're looking at the moment is we know there's a real gap in early intervention. So for people that I call the walking wobbly, they're still functioning, but, there's stuff in there that's not been expressed or shared or dealt with. And we're looking at developing a residential wellbeing program where we take people away for 4 days of intensive work with trauma therapists to help them say, well, why am I angry? Why am I withdrawn? Why do I drink too much? Why can't I sleep? Why am I behaving the way I'm behaving? And we work with them over those 4 days to help them develop a plan for themselves. And the whole aim of that is is that they don't get seriously ill and that they don't become a work cover claim. So that's an example. And that's something that the agencies individually can't do. They don't have the financial capacity, they don't have the resource capacity, and it just makes so much sense to do it as a collaborative. So in Victoria and everywhere, people think of emergency services as, you know, all the lights and sirens, and it is those agencies. But there's also a lot of support agencies. So we involve people like Red Cross, St John, Life Saving Victoria, Victorian Council of Churches, you know, all of those things, plus the administrative government agencies. And we bring them all together. So we've got 16 members.
Yeah, that's quite a lot to oversight, in a sense, with what you're just describing, because
it's herding cats.
Yeah, it is. and some feral ones, I'd imagine too. Because it was something I was thinking about prior to having the conversation with you, is that about the inclusion of a whole range of people, because the frontline people can only really operate if there's people that are providing that support behind them. And, you know, in the services like, you know, when there's the bushfires on and you see the people preparing the lunches and the tea and the coffee and the respite for when they come back off the front line to the new ones going, you know, and you tend not to think of that on a regular basis. So when you are doing the research into that, do you research that behind the scenes much?
Absolutely. I'll give you an amazing statistic. There's 139,000 people work in emergency management in Victoria. Now that's more than people that are employed by all universities in Australia. It's almost the same as the health system. It's a massive number of people. The vast majority of those people are volunteers, you know, so it's a huge number of people. And that includes those support roles that you're talking about, you know. So when we talk about emergencies, it's about preparedness, response and recovery. So there's different stages. And we talk about the long tail of an event. So the floods, the rain has stopped, long since stopped in Victoria, but that long tail of recovery is still going on and affecting so many people. So yes, and we're just about to do a piece of work which is looking at vicarious trauma. So it's people who are not at the front line, but they're in support roles, and they might have to deal with photographs of things or read reports about things, or be the person who's sitting in a recovery centre and listening to the terrible, terrible stories of the impact of an event. So we're just about to start some research on vicarious trauma to understand, well, what roles in the sector does that have the potential to impact, and what can we do about it?
So it sounds like you've got a lot of skills that you offer, but maybe just jumping back in your career a little bit, what service did you get involved in and why?
Okay, well, I'm a classic example of a woman of my era that had no mentors, no career plan. I started as a secondary teacher. A few steps along the way, I was in state government, and actually somebody rang me and said they'd heard about me and would I go and work for the CFA. And I said, oh, look, I'll give you 12 months. I want to have a family. Well, I didn't end up having a family, and I ended up there for a lot longer than 12 months. And like most people in the emergency services, it just gets in your blood. You know, all the research we do of people in the emergency services, they have one thing in common, and that is that they want to give back to the community. They are generally such good people. So I ended up on the executive at the CFA, and I left, and I frankly got burnt out after 5 volunteers died at Linton in Victoria up near Ballarat. I was involved in that from woe to go, you know, what was just a bog standard fire in the afternoon. Then it turned into a situation where these 5 people unfortunately died.
I do remember that.
It was hideous. And then I was involved in organising memorial services and coronial events and cultural change and everything. So it just took over my life, and I crashed. And I didn't have anybody to sort of take me under their arm and say, go and do something for yourself and come back refreshed. which is what this residential program's all about.
How did you sort of get through that period of time?
Personally, I dealt with it all myself, which is not how it should have been dealt with. And that we know that didn't work because more than 20 years later, I saw across the room at a conference the strike team leader from that event, who I hadn't seen for 20 years, and I promptly burst into tears. So, classic example of the walking wobbly, carrying something that you don't often acknowledge that you're carrying or know that you're carrying, but you are carrying it. And so that was a classic example of vicarious trauma.
In my own original career, which is a long superseded part of the old air traffic service system, I'd been transferred from Melbourne to Darwin in mid-74 and ended up, I was technically transferred to Katherine 2 weeks before Cyclone Tracy. But we had 2 young children, an 8-month-old, but we drove back up to Darwin on Christmas Eve to spend with some friends, and we were caught up in the cyclone. And then fortunately our car was damaged but drivable when we got back to Katherine, and I went back to work on Boxing Day, and my little flight service unit, which was only normally 6 staff, but me being the extra person on sort of local training, we end up provided all the radio communications for the airlift, and we went from a daylight hours station to 24 hours instantly, and so the 6 of us or 7 of us were working 2 shifts a day, and then my family was sort of dealing with, let's get the kids out. We loaded the car up, sort of followed some work colleagues' families down towards Melbourne, and I was at work on the Saturday, so this is only two and a half days later. I've already worked about 5 shifts.
Yes, that's emergency management.
It is, and then just after lunch or midday on the Saturday, the phone rings, and I thought, asking for me, and I answered the phone, and it says, the first words were, "Don't panic." And it was a policeman at Elliot ringing up to say that the family were in a car accident, but fortunately they were okay. But I realised that after the fortnight, dealt with all that, and I just crashed for 24 hours, but it didn't really have any support, like you were saying. You started to deal with it yourself. You've dealt with all this intensity in a short period of time, but you still got to keep on going.
But if you think of emergency service workers, they see stuff every day that the rest of us don't see. They're paid to run towards that, whereas we see it, we run away and we pick up the phone and call 000. But they've got no choice. They've got to run towards these things. And, we know now the impact of that on people. And we're encouraging people now to recognise if there is an issue and to say, you know what? In fact, I was speaking to a policewoman this morning, and she was telling me how there was an incident, I don't know what it was, yesterday, where one of her team said to her, I'm not best placed to respond to this job because I know that's going to trigger me in a way that's going to put me off work for a long time. And, that's courageous to be able to say that. And we need people to be able to speak up like that.
That's an important aspect about recognising things, and that's why I think, from what I witnessed about emergency services, now it was last year that you contacted Seahorse about participating in the International Women's Day in March earlier this year. What prompted you to sort of contact me as the president of Seahorse?
International Women's Day focus on women, and we got feedback from the sector a couple of years ago is that, here's an opportunity when you've got a huge room full of, quite a few hundred people. Let's broaden it out to more diversity and inclusion issues. And they prompted me to do that. I saw a compass show that you were on, And, you know, I'll be perfectly honest, I don't know any trans people. You know, it's just not my circle. And so I saw you on that, and I thought, and I wrote it down, and I thought, I'm going to come back to that. So when it was time to organise the event, I contacted you, and, you know, I'm really glad I did, because you got such a great reception from people.
I felt quite privileged to be there on the day. Admittedly, all I had was a very tiny little part, but that was what really impressed me about the day, was the range of people who got up to speak in their little segment. And, you know, there was an organisation who did have a trans person transitioning at their work, and then you had another organisation that had somebody with different abilities being welcomed as a full team member, and that was quite impressive. And then you had a range of people with different ages, and one thing that did stand out was, can't remember the person or the organisation, but where this particular woman, the boss, a male, specifically went to and said, I want you to step up and take a leadership role. And I thought that was very impressive, of having somebody in a senior leader position recognising somebody who might have just otherwise been brushed aside.
When I started at the CFA, you know, a long time ago now, I'm trying to think when it was, probably about 2000, my first day I arrived there, I walked into a room and it was me, woman, 256 men. And I know that because I counted them. And I thought, oh, Lordy, what have I got myself into here? And, you know, it's changed so much. And, you know, as a consequence of that, I started a women's program at CFA to try and promote young women that were just great. And because they didn't have a voice, I got them to do all of these change initiatives and to identify things that could improve the organisation. So I've always had a bit of a passion for that. And so I started this big International Women's Day for the sector, because when I started, there was nothing for them to come together. And so we've really spread that out now so that there is a lot more focus on diversity and inclusion. And look, the sector is not brilliant, you know, but the sector recognises the need to do this. And they're certainly by no means an exemplifier in terms of what they're doing, but they're trying really hard to be better and to be more inclusive, because the sector's started to look out about not just what they're doing, but the customer experience. You know, what does the community see when they look at the emergency services? You know, and the police have done really good work in terms of diversity and inclusion. And, you know, other agencies are doing that as well now.
Yeah, because I know, you know, there's quite a few trans people in the police force in particular, who, going back a number of years ago, when the first person that openly transitioned was sort of ridiculed by certain newspapers and the like. And but I've noticed the change enormously, you know, and even getting stopped for traffic offences, the fact that it's dealing with the issue and not making sarcastic or denigrating remarks to the individuals. So it's quite clearly a strong evidence that the world is changing in that sense. What sort of things are you looking towards the future a little bit?
Look, it's not just the Emergency Services Foundation, because our focus is on mental health and wellbeing. So when we do International Women's Day, we always do it with a focus on mental health and wellbeing. And that being that if someone's discriminated against, how does it make them feel, and what does it do to their mental health and wellbeing? And the same applies to a whole range of other people with, you know, different. And that's the focus that the Emergency Service is putting on it, the Foundation is putting on it. But the agencies in the sector more generally, what they're thinking about is we've got to represent the community that we serve, you know. And you need that diversity. We all know that just from women, when there's diversity on a board or on an executive team or in an organisation, it's more creative. There's a different decision-making processes. Things change. So we just want that diversity to be a better organisation.
And that's sort of relevant in what I'm involved with, a social support group, is encouraging people to say, try and develop, one, the confidence in yourself just to be yourself, because my observation and that of many others is that if you demonstrate a confidence in yourself as opposed to a bravado, that people then are more likely to relate to you better, less likely to be aggressive to you, and therefore pay more attention to what you have to offer. And it's one of the things that I've sort of been quite observant about over the last 15 or more years involved in Seahorse. That
very wise.
As people become, you encourage them to become comfortable with themselves, not necessarily focus on how you look, although a lot of us like to look in the mirror, but that's a separate issue. But having that confidence just to walk down and hold your head up high and say that. So when you combine it with what you're doing, is you say, yes, I can recognise I've reached a point where I do need to reach out and ask for help and not feel embarrassed to do it.
That's right, that's right. And you know, in the sector there is a Pride network, for example, and there's a piece of work going on, not driven by the Emergency Services Foundation, but a sector-wide piece of work at the moment, where there's a bit of a survey going around to say, well, you know, what are we doing for LGBTQI plus people? You know, what could we do better? What is the big issue in the sector? And they're doing a bit of a baseline, where are we now in terms of our attitudes and behaviours? And that's, there's a survey, and then they're doing some workshops because they want to gather people so that they can collectively drive change through lived experience, which is the big thing now, is you know, drawing on that lived experience of people. And, you know, that's very popular. And I was speaking to one person who is actually from the SES down in Gippsland. And they've done a marvellous thing down there where they've and this was off his own bat, this person. And he brought together people from across, you know, like ambulance, police, forest fire, firefighting, SES down there, and said, created like a mini Pride network down there. And their aim is just to collaborate, to learn from each other what the different agencies are doing down there, but to get out into events and locally and be seen and just build safety and awareness and confidence, as you say, both for the community but also from within the organisation, so that they can see, you know, if we can do that, then we can recruit people, you know, that feel safe in this environment.
Well, I know just from my own experience in another sort of community type based organisation that I went along initially as an exercise in being publicly looking this way and presenting as my female self, that I made a very conscious effort not to sort of talk about this side of my life in the function of the organisation. And I found I've been there almost 15 years now, and I've been very well respected and accepted for what I can contribute and the skills that I have.
So many different roles that people can play. And, you know, when I was back at CFA, back at that time that I said, you know, it was really when we started to get into community education. And once upon a time, if you're a CFA volunteer, all you did was firefighting. But there's so many different roles now that volunteers play. You know, community education is a huge part of it. All sorts of liaison and support roles.
One of the things I might sort of look to round out our conversation, when I did attend the International Women's Day in March there, I met Tony, who was, I think, the chair of the board,
Yes.
and he was about to set off on a big trek around Victoria to obviously raise awareness and hopefully some funds. Could you tell me a bit about that?
What a mammoth effort that was. And, you know, from two perspectives. One, Tony, feet on the tarmac, you know, he walked 1,500 kilometres in 50 days. And we went from, one day was 38 degrees, and then when we were up on Mount Hotham it was -1. So we had all conditions, and he just plodded along every day. And talk about support crew, that's what we did. You know, in every town that he stopped, we had an event. We engaged with the local emergency service people in the community, and the whole idea was to raise awareness of the toll that emergency service work can have on people, make it safe for people to talk, and to raise money along the way. And the money was primarily for that residential wellbeing program. And, you know, as he walked on average about 30 kilometres a day, people would walk with him. Some walked the whole day with him, some walked little bits of the day, and they all had stories to tell and to share. And what it really proved to us is people just want a safe space to talk. They want someone to listen, and they want to be able to tell their story and share their story. So it was an amazing thing that you know, was achieved, and what Tony did. And, you know, it had a physical toll on him. He suffered some injuries along the way. But we're now looking ahead to 2024, and we're walking Everest Base Camp in March next year. So there's a group, there's an ambulance officer and a firefighter who are helping us lead that, and we're taking a group to Everest Base Camp with the same idea, is that it's side by side, they're walking, and they'll be talking as they go, and that it'll all be about raising awareness of mental health for emergency service workers and raising money.
Outside the emergency service community, has the impact of what Tony did and that awareness that was raised, do you finding that's still in the broad community?
Not as much as I would like. We call them the grateful public. You know, if you have a situation where you need to have the fire brigade at your house or the paramedics or something, you're grateful. Invariably, they've saved your life, they've saved your property or something like that. But as a general rule, corporately, we haven't been able to engage those people as much as what we would have liked.
As we've alluded to through the whole conversation, the emergency services there, not just sitting quietly in the corner, but they're there for that urgent thing that needs to be done. And of course, we'd like to be able to, when I need it, call upon them.
Well, you expect it, don't you? Expect if you call 000, they're going to be there for you. And invariably they are.
With that sort of very positive thing, they're there if you need them, and they always invariably are. On that, thank you, Susan, for joining us in the conversation today, and I hope this also raises awareness. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm Graham McGeary. My guest has been Siusan MacKenzie, CEO of Emergency Services Foundation.